Another thing that can happen is we could get some JSON that has null in it, right? That's not a concept in Elm. Elm doesn't have null, but JavaScript and by extension JSON absolutely have it. So how do we handle it when we receive something like that? Another question we might have is what happens when we have a field that is optional? In other words, sometimes it's going to be present and sometimes it's not. So here we have a different data structure that we're decoding into it, a different version of user, and also some different JSON that's going to be going into it. So in this JSON, we have a user ID, which is an integer just like before. We have a name field, which in this case is null. And on the Elm side, we say, okay, ID is going to be an integer just like before. Name is maybe going to be a string, maybe not. But email is something we explicitly expect to always be set. However, it's not present in the JSON. This JSON does not include an email address. So how do we handle these things? Well, we start off essentially the same way as we did before. We're saying we're going to make a user that's going to be a decoder of user. We start off with JSON.decode.succeed, once again, passing in user, which is going to be a function that takes an int, and this time a maybe string, and then a string, and finally returns a user. So far, so good, same as before. The first step we're going to do is we're going to decode the user ID. Again, same as before, because there's no change. It's present, it's always going to be present, and it's going to decode directly from an int on the JavaScript side to an int on the Elm side. No change there. There is necessarily going to have to be a change here for two reasons. One is on the name side, on the JavaScript side, name is null, or sorry, on the JSON side, name is null, and on the Elm side, name is a maybe string. Fortunately, there's a decoder combinator called Nullable. And so Nullable is a function that takes a decoder and then returns a maybe version of whatever that thing decodes to. So just like we saw, you could have a list string, which gives you back a decoder of a list of strings. You say nullable string, that takes a decoder string and gives you back a decoder of maybe string. And as you might guess, the way that it decides whether to use a just or a nothing depends on whether the value is either null or not null. So in this example, because name is coming in as null, that will come in as nothing on the Elm side. If, on the other hand, name had come in as a string, that would come in as just and then the string on the Elm side. So an important implication of this is that we have to say up front whether or not we expect null to be coming in from JSON here. So we're saying this is explicitly nullable, whereas int, we say null is not okay. If we'd had an int in this field, this would fail to decode. Finally, we have to deal with the fact that email is something that we require on the Elm side, but which is not actually present on the JavaScript side. One way we could do this, which is something we'll see in the exercise, is there's something we can say called hard-coded, which says, you know what, just ignore the JSON, always put this value in. But we want to do something slightly different here. What we want to say is, here's what to do if email is present, and then also here's what to do if email is not present. We're going to provide a fallback. And here, instead of saying required, we say optional. So we're saying we have an optional field called email, and if that field is present, we expect it to be a string. And if that string is present, then we're going to use that as our value. It's going to go into this email thing right here. However, if that value is not present, we're going to fall back on this default value, me@foo.com. So because the email field is not even present in this JSON object, that's okay. It just means we're going to use this fallback, and that value is going to be what's going to get set to user. So between all these things, we have user ID being set the same way as before. We have this nullable string, which handles the possibility that name is either null or not null, and that corresponds to this name field up here. And finally, we have the optional email string, which is going to look for a field called email, but if it's not there, it's going to fall back on this value. So in that way, we're able to handle even these edge cases of JSON of null, of fields being missing, and still consistently decode into either this user, or if anything went wrong in any of these steps, fail the decoding, and then we will handle that the same way that we did before.